Thank you, Carmen. And of course, as the Director of Development, and as we approach the end of the year, I do want to remind everybody that we are in the midst of our end of year fundraising campaign. This is where your donations come in and are so important to us because this is where we fund the work that we do, where we fund the research projects that we have to advance research into ME/CFS and other post-infection diseases, where we can do our advocacy work to advocate the government for better recognition and more funding for research through them. So we are also in the middle of a double your gift challenge. So if you do give during this time, our wonderful board of directors has pledged $500,000 and they will match gifts up to a total of $500,000. So if you give during this time, anytime between now and December 31st, your gift will be doubled. You can visit solveme.org/donate to give today. Okay. And with that, I'd like to introduce Ryan Pryor. Ryan is a journalist and author who has written and produced hundreds of stories under byline across CNN, USA Today, and the Daily Beast, covering both the 2012 and the 2016 elections. In 2019, he wrote the story that received the highest reader engagement of any CNN story published for the entire year. A 5-time Stanford Medicine e-patient scholar, Ryan is also the co-director, writer, and producer of the feature film Forgotten Plague. The documentary tells the story of ME/CFS and is available on Amazon Prime. The Huffington Post called it a must-see documentary. Most recently, and why he is our guest today, Ryan has authored the book, The Long Haul, which is released tomorrow. The Long Haul details the people and politics surrounding the development of the long COVID pandemic through the personal memoir lens of a science writer who himself has the disease. Published by Post Hill Press and distributed by Simon & Schuster, the book is now available in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook at bookstores everywhere. Ryan is also a newly appointed fellow and journalist in residence at the Century Foundation, working for its Disability Economic Justice Collaborative. Ryan, welcome, and we are excited to have you here.
Yeah.
I should also mention, sorry, I did not when we prior, but we are going to be giving away 10 copies of Ryan's book, The Long Haul, to randomly selected registrants at the webinar. So if you like what Ryan says about his book, hopefully you will have a chance to win it. So Ryan, why don't you talk to us first to start off about the origins of your book, what inspired you to write it, and what's your goal? What do you hope to accomplish with it?
Yeah, and thank you again for having me. I'm excited to be here and to speak with everyone. And some people think that how did you manage to write a book about long COVID in the first couple of years of the pandemic, and also have these say things like long COVID is so new. How could you write something about it so quickly? We're still finding out what it is. But really the truth is this book is 15 years in the making. And most of what we know about long COVID is similar to what we know about ME/CFS, if not a outright repeat. And so the origins of the book for me start in 2006 and 2007 as a high school student who came down with a mysterious disease that forced me to drop out of high school for about 7 months, and saw about 15 different doctors, none of whom really had the ability to diagnose me. And kind of a similar story that many patients have of going to a neurologist or a rheumatologist or infectious disease doctor, on down this list of specialists, none of whom can quite make the diagnosis. So eventually I found a doctor that worked for me and was able to get through college and can work full time, only because of taking about 20 pills a day and giving myself a shot every week and getting an IV treatment every month. And even with that, I've frequently been on periods of disability where I didn't take several weeks off from work. So I have always known, like, there, but by the grace of God, go I with this illness and trying to have a career. But because of some of my experiences early in my career of writing for USA Today about my own personal story, and then that leading to crowdfunding $150,000 to do a film, traveling around the country, interviewing scientists from Stanford and Harvard and Columbia, and that came out as Forgotten Plague in 2015, and then I was able to become a Stanford Medicine X e-patient scholar, and met people who were doing similar work across a range of diseases, who either for brain cancer or autism or narcolepsy or cystic fibrosis, writing books or funding clinical trials or advocating the government for their conditions, and it had a consciousness about a much larger set of methods by which patient advocates can rally online communities to combat their own conditions. So I happened to be a science writer for CNN right as the pandemic was starting. And so a lot of my feature writing experience of doing magazine style stories, especially about human-centered topics, that I wanted to apply that lens to the work. And I understood that there was going to be pretty significant long-term consequences from SARS-CoV-2. The chronic illness community really predicted the rise of long COVID. So got to work pitching and writing and reporting as many stories about long COVID as I could. And then eventually found a book agent, and we pitched this as a book length work. And so I got to work doing this in long form, because I really felt like this is, you can't do justice to the story in just a couple articles.
Is there a larger goal in writing this book in terms of, obviously long COVID is not necessarily accepted by everybody. Is there a goal to this? Are we, in terms of better visibility for the disease, a better voice for the patients?
Yeah, the subtitle, so the book is called The Long Haul, and the subtitle says solving the puzzle of the pandemic's long haulers and how they are changing healthcare forever. So the parts of the story, tell my own personal story, but most of the book is telling the story of patient advocates who first found each other on online communities, and who ultimately gained the attention of the CDC and the WHO and the NIH, and who named the condition, who of course endured it, and who did the first research, and really who continued to be the ones advocating and leading. So this is the book features a story of the patient-led research collaborative. There's an important message here about changing health, about long COVID, about changing the way our medical system treats long COVID. But more broadly, there's a message here about how regular people, it could be patients, could be people experiencing a range of different policy issues or policy failures. How do citizen scientists, how do citizens together bind up and create the coalitions to build a more equitable world? That could be for long COVID, that could be for various diseases, and it could be for topics well outside of healthcare as well.
Were there any obstacles you encountered or any surprises you found along the way as you were out researching the book, researching and writing the book?
Yeah, my hope would have been to have a happier ending. That I think I was naive enough to believe that there was going to be some cure to the disease. I held out hope that this in the last chapter, some heroic figure swoops in and the whole problem goes away. And I don't know how or why I thought that would be the case, but I thought that we know that this was going to be the most important moment or most important year or 2 years in a whole generation in terms of rethinking how our medical system sees complex chronic diseases. And I hoped that there would be some moment where it was clear that it has now officially changed. Now these diseases are now accepted, or not just that these diseases are accepted, but they're treated, and that every doctor is now hereby educated about them. So it was that was probably the biggest sense of disillusionment as I was writing, is I wanted to be able to have it be from a human standpoint. I wanted it to be more tied up, but really as a storytelling device, as an author, I wanted there to be a clear ending. And some of the stories that I've written for CNN that had, there's one that was the most read story of 2019. In that piece was about someone who was a college dropout who was bedridden for 11 years, and then he invented a surgery and cured himself. And the cured part of that is what I look for these amazing stories of human redemption, of descending into the depths and then pulling yourself out by some miraculous feat of ingenuity and passion and hope and action. And I was seeing millions of people plunge into the depths of long COVID. And I was also seeing them, this amazing collection of humanity pulling themselves out of it, and stemming from hope and leading with action. And I do see the powers that be listening to them, but change is a little slower than I would like. And that was absolutely the most challenging part of the writing process.
We've seen a lot of changes and in the idea with long COVID and the attention that it's gotten, it has put more of a spotlight on ME/CFS and people who have been suffering with that for a very long time. How do you think the long COVID has impacted the role of patients in research and care, and how the long COVID pandemic is influencing how we look at ME/CFS?
Yeah, there's a person featured in the book who I admire greatly, and I'm happy to consider her almost more like a friend, who I was one of the first people who I interviewed. She was the chief technology officer for the Department of Health and Human Services, named Susanna Fox. And she wrote a blog post where she said that she had been studying patient communities for 20 years as her career. She had started as a journalist, running the website for U.S. News and World Report, and then she spent the next 20 years researching health as it relates to the internet. And most of the time that was about radical patient communities who had bound together to fix their particular problem. That could be ALS, could be essentially any disease. And she said that what she found was that this peer-to-peer health innovation pipeline was accelerating at a faster clip than ever before in her career. That from the moment that the word long COVID was coined by Dr. Elisa Perigo in the spring, there's an Italian archaeologist who had chronic illness and said she noticed there was something called long COVID. And then leading up to the Director General of the World Health Organization recognizing it as a condition was about 4 months. And that sort of rapid innovation was unprecedented in the history, and that was patient-led. That was not initiated by scientists or by the medical establishment. And knowing how that took place in the midst of a global crisis, in the midst of a world-changing pandemic, there's best principles about how these groups, one of which is called the Body Politics Support Group, which was came together on Slack. And how can we use those same sets of ideas to influence the rest of healthcare? And furthermore, the reason why body politic was as successful as it was is that ME/CFS patients had joined early on and explained to them what this chronic complex illness really was. And so ME/CFS patients' DNA are all over this world-changing development.
You also interviewed for the book Solve's own Emily Taylor, Vice President of Advocacy and Engagement. And so what do you think the future of that kind of advocacy might look like? You know, we do a lot of work in Washington trying to get the government to allocate more funds for research and get medical organizations to officially recognize ME/CFS and long COVID as conditions. What do you think might be some meaningful wins in that area?
Yeah, as an author, I'll say I would love to be able to give this book to every member of Congress to help educate the member or their staff even more about the illness. And that Solve has been doing incredible work for not just for the last 2 years, but really for the entire time that I've been sick and aware of the illness. There's a specific set of a few different bills: a Treat Long COVID Act, Care for Long COVID Act, and the Long Haulers Act. In particular, one of them is sponsored by Representative Ayanna Pressley. Another is being led by Senator Tim Kaine. Senator Tim Kaine is a long hauler himself. Representative Pressley is a leader in disability advocacy. So those are a few areas we would need to see quite a bit more work done on drug repurposing. There is a $1.15 billion recover initiative that has been ongoing. I cover that in the book. That's quite a bit more in the observational category, and clinical trials that are connected to recover have been very slow. That was a frustration for me as a reporter, is wanting to not just to report on clinical trials, but to report on the results of them and whether or not new drugs got approved or authorized. And that's been slow. So I think that engaging in public-private partnerships to fast track drug repurposing, to know the biomarker around long COVID, which will probably be a version of what we've been seeing in ME/CFS for a generation, and to move quickly on getting those drugs available to as many patients as possible. And that's been slow, and I think figuring out how to use legislators to fast track some of those processes is where I'd like to focus my advocacy efforts around the book in the next 6 months.
We know there are some people out there who don't think that long COVID has impacted the world of the landscape of ME/CFS at all, or hasn't done it positively. Many of us think that it has done it, when we say positively, at least in terms of bringing more attention to ME/CFS, and that research done into long COVID will have application in ME/CFS and vice versa. How do you think that has long COVID impacted the landscape?
I would see it as it's a positive thing in terms of awareness. It's certainly a negative thing in terms of the sheer number of people who are getting long COVID. If 1 million people had ME/CFS, and then it takes 10 million more getting sick with a similar disease just for the 1 million to get some level of recognition, I in no way want to be seen as celebrating the huge severity. So that's one thing. But these two conditions are kind of birds of a feather. They're on the. I've been telling people they're kind of like on the spectrum. They thinking in terms of like autism or Asperger's, and exactly where, or are they exactly the same thing or overlapping? Those are with mast cell activation syndrome, postural orthostatic tachycardia, ME/CFS, fibromyalgia, chronic Lyme. They're all in this similar grouping of diseases, and understanding them as the complex chronic conditions that they are, that have been neglected for quite some time. It makes a lot of sense to group them all together politically, clinically, scientifically, and across in any category in order to achieve that critical mass where it is possible to do work at scale and with the level of budget that's required. And I'll take it even further, just to say that bringing the chronic illness community, those 6 or 7 conditions, into the wider disability tent is probably the most effective way to get the broadest recognition and that's part of what I'm doing with this Disability Economic Justice Collaborative as my next role through the Century Foundation.
I know for Solve, one of our sort of dream projects and something that we're starting to explore is having an institute at the National Institutes of Health and being able to create an institute for ME/CFS, long COVID, other post-viral diseases. That's a huge lift, but one that we're starting to investigate undertaking. How do you see it? I mean, we see that as changing the landscape completely of how these diseases are looked at by the government, by the medical community. How do you see a project like that if we were able to do that?
Yeah, so the way that the NIH is organized, there's 27 different institutes, and so there's the National Institute for Neurological Disease and Stroke, and we can list off, but largely they're categorized around anatomical system, among other reasons. And so the problem about why ME/CFS that is not really recognized is it doesn't really have a natural home in a particular institute. It's a complex condition, so it's a multi-system disease. So they're creating a institute where it's possible to do multi-system research around chronic conditions is the simple approach, and we can get dramatically more complex about it, but that's the basic theory of the case. So these are all Zainab Tawfiki from the New York Times wrote a piece recently advocating for National Institute for Post-Viral Conditions. I'll appear tomorrow on the think tank panel, or on Wednesday actually, with on the Center for Economic Policy Research and the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center. They've come out with a report asking for a National Institute for Complex Chronic Conditions. Exactly how people phrase this is going to vary a little bit, but it is a national institute for these types of diseases. And I see people coalescing around this objective, and I'll certainly put my fingers on the scale and say that this looks like that this is the right solution as well. And yeah, happy to engage in over the next months and years to make it a reality. I think it's a smart move.
One of the struggles in all of this, getting more research dollars, getting more recognition, has been the idea of misinformation. And ME/CFS patients have been dealing with this for decades. Long COVID patients are starting to deal with it now. We have seen very, very recently that it is still going on, and there are articles being published about with incredible misinformation about how this is all psychosomatic, et cetera. Give us sort of your summary of how you sort of see that and how patients can help with that.
Yeah, it seemed clear, especially early on in the pandemic, that if people were getting a virus March 2020, and if they're still sick April, May, June, July, that is clearly in biophysical disease that they're experiencing. And it didn't really occur to me or that this was going to be hard to understand, that it would be useful to try to see that through a psychogenic lens, because it was more abundantly clear than ever that there is a viral trigger. And so we've known that there's a viral trigger or an infectious trigger for these types of diseases for as long as I've been alive. And that there is this competing school of thought that believes that because they can't quite find a specific biomarker, then they lump people into a psychogenic camp. There's that habit has yet to die off, and so there's a piece came out recently in a major magazine advocating or highlighting the efforts of researchers, particularly in the UK, who do not we'll just aren't fully up to speed on a lot of the exciting biomolecular research going on. And I think there's an incredible story to be told about the inspiring progress of science. Looking at microclimates has been one of the most intriguing developments. Looking at the cause of long COVID and potentially ME/CFS. We know there's a tremendous number of immune abnormalities. We know that there's an exhaustive list of neurological abnormalities. It could be that this entire disease process is being driven by some version of a vagus nerve infection. It could be driven by viral reservoirs in the body. A long list of causes, none of which are psychological, and so there's a problem of some long COVID clinics are using an outdated form of therapy, graded exercise therapy, and so from a rhetoric standpoint, and making the argument as a journalist, getting it out in front of bad information is something I spend a lot of time thinking about, and framing this story as an exciting, heroic, patient-led journey in which people's the lived experience is celebrated, and that the people who actually have gone through the disease are brought to the fore. As we center around those narratives, it's inherently more accurate as a story. And reporters who don't spend enough time talking with people who actually have the disease are likely to get it wrong. So I published a disability reporting guide through Open Mind magazine a couple months ago. Number one principle on the list for journalists is talk to disabled people. If you do that, you're less likely to get the story wrong. And when people do write stories about disabilities that are poor and not well done, it can almost always revolve back to the fact that they didn't talk to people. If you're a reporter, you got to go out and talk to people, the right people.
Speaking about talking to people, were there any particular interviews that stood out for you or surprised you in the researching of the book?
One of my favorite interviews was with Amy Pearl from the Polybio Research Foundation, and that was actually following from a Solve webinar. And one of the reasons why I think Amy is, and Mike Van Alzaker, who's her research partner at Polybio, what they're doing is among the most provocative and innovative work in the field. And they for my purposes, they did a few things that were incredibly useful. Is that one, they published an exhaustive review of all of the literature in post-infectious diseases to date, contextualizing all of it in one massive research article that was great to draw from, to make sure that I wasn't missing anything, and that Liz Weaver, who is my researcher for the book, we wanted to make sure that we had the full context of it, because as a science reporter, it's challenging to have studies come out every day or every week and not know where they fit into this larger puzzle. So we're really building a scientific mosaic, and each little tile is important, but you need to figure out where to put that tile in this larger picture that's emerging. And so Amy did an excellent job. Amy and Mike did a great job with that lit review, and part of that was boiled down into a Solve webinar that I thought was quite useful, where she talks about 7 major principles. And so that one of the chapters, chapter 13 in this book, the theory of everything, the theory of everything being like, what is this full mosaic? And having a handful of guidelines about buckets as each new research study comes out. Where do we put it? Where does it matter? Is this a repeat of what we already know, or is it something new? If it is a repeat of what we already know about infection-associated chronic diseases, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we do want to actually make sure that we're enabling scientists to design better experiments that expand on what's most promising in these smaller pilot studies.
Did the book help open any doors for you that maybe had been close to you before, or lead you in provide a resource that you weren't aware of, that you weren't aware of before?
Yeah, that when I was writing the chapter about disability, I contacted someone from a disability researcher at a think tank, Rebecca Vallis, and wanted to interview her about how this large number of newly disabled people, if they were not going to get better, how were Social Security or public assistance programs or Medicare, Medicaid, insurance systems, how as a society were we going to take care of these people? Was a question on the tip of my tongue that needed a strong answer for. And Rebecca was the we hit it off talking with her, not just in that interview, and not just in a few other areas where we were able to initiate a collaboration, but she offers a lens for thinking about this that that was powerful and I had never encountered before in more than a decade of working on these types of topics. Is that we know human rights is one of the most important ways to think about the world, and that could be through civil rights or women's rights, gay rights, or disability rights being equal partner there. And there's a system of services for people who are disabled, and there's a system of legal rights that they're entitled to because they are human beings. So if we can encapsulate all of these chronic disease groups and lump them into the disability rights category and then up into the human rights category, and if we can think about it from that intellectual framework, I think that that's probably our most powerful way to make this case. And I had not really fully come to understand that until speaking with Rebecca. So that was one of the most interesting relationships that developed into a much different lens for seeing the world. And so I'm very grateful for that. And that's one of the later chapters in the book.
One of the things that we know here at Solve is our patients, our friends, keep themselves really well informed about the disease. What are you reading now, or what would you suggest that people who want to keep up on the forefront of what's going on? Are there sources that they can look out for, that they should be reading?
Right. I was going to say that not to pander to you, but the Solve webinars were great for me to try to keep up on material as it was coming out. The Body Politics Support Group is another one. And that's a Slack group for patients with long COVID. And I'm a board member for the ME Action Network, so we encourage people to be involved with both Solve and ME Action, because I think that those frequently operate in pretty complementary ways. And if it's not, and ME Action has a lot of Facebook support groups, and depending on your social media channel of choice, if it's Facebook, Twitter, Slack, etc., or doing things, receiving email newsletters or participating in Zoom situations. So that, a lot of the best knowledge comes from patients themselves, and so it comes from the community itself. And so following a publication is great. Court Johnson's Health Rising blog is one of the best in the field. But actually interacting directly with other patients themselves and figuring out how your specific version of the illness actually probably matches with another person's. There's people sometimes talk about like a matching app, almost like a dating app for chronic illness, which would be to find someone whose illness is most similar to you, and then you become buddies in your journey toward trying to heal. But I think the greatest insight from my book and the way how I would advocate for long haulers being a force for changing the future of healthcare highlight this value of peer-to-peer support communities, and that being a form of knowledge generation in itself. That citizen science has real value.
I want to move to a couple of our attendee questions, participant questions. Just a reminder, if you do have questions, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. One, you got a very nice compliment. Yay, Ryan, thank you for all your work. So I'd love to pass that along. And also, I got a question, which never happens on these things. I'm not going to answer the question now because I don't want to take away from Ryan, but to the person who asked the question, we will get some information on that for you, and we will reach out via email. But one of our attendees asked, what's the best source of information that a patient could share with physicians who are not familiar with long COVID or ME/CFS?
Yeah, there's a few I think that are for long COVID specifically. I'll mention the long COVID physio as a group of physical therapists and rehab docs who experience long COVID themselves. So the long COVID physio website is one that has a list of resources and protocols and explains it in terms, from doctors themselves. A great resource. The American Academy of Physical Medicine and Rehab, AAPMNR, has a set of consensus statements and documents from dozens of long COVID clinics around the country that describe what they're seeing and how best to respond to it. So I would encourage people to point their doctors to those consensus statements, and those are a lot of great information there around pacing and around managing it as a ME/CFS like post-viral condition. The ME/CFS Clinician Coalition, which is led by Dr. Lucinda Bateman, has a great website with lots of important treatment information that doctors can use and patients can easily relay. But so there's a few out there. The CDC has put out better information, and so that they have one pagers and hand out some flyers that that patients can get to their doctors as well. But I think the more detailed stuff from the ME/CFS Clinician Coalition and from long COVID physio are two particularly useful resources.
And we did just put in the chat a link to our resource for people, so you can go into the chat and click on that link, and that has several long COVID resources for healthcare providers. Couple other questions that are coming in. One said that you mentioned you were planning to write a few op-eds. What are you planning to focus on for those?
When you frequently, as an author, you go write 80,000 words, and so then you can celebrate the occasion of having written a whole book by receiving more opportunities to write more stuff. So that once the reward for work is more work, is partly how I see it from an author standpoint. But you write op-eds in order to help increase the visibility of the book, and obviously here is to continue the reporting and continue the story, because a lot of it really interesting things happened in the aftermath. Once we got this book locked in the summer of this year, this past year, there's been a lot of really interesting things I would have loved to written about. So that's it's going to be contingent on the publication, which publications are interested in what time, at what point, and what their editors' bandwidth is. So as currently as a freelancer, so I'm not employed by CNN at the moment, so I don't have like a direct line of pipeline to get stuff out. And I don't know what the deadlines for, so I'm giving that's a long answer about the inside baseball of how journalism works, but one of those will be a more personal story related to me. One of them is going to be about, if these get published, one will be about the role of patient communities in spotting long COVID and how the healthcare system can be redesigned, or parts of it can be designed to center around peer-to-peer health communities. Another one that I would hope to write would be about ARPA-H, which is a new agency just created by the Biden administration. I think there's tremendous potential there to do high risk, high reward research to scale and commercialize some of the really good ideas that have come out of smaller pilot studies, microclots being one of them, Ron Davis's NATO needle at Stanford being one. You can list off a lot of high-tech innovations that could, given proper funding and given the right attention, may show promise at a much greater scale. And I think ARPA-H is modeled after DARPA, which was from the research agency for the Defense Department that created technologies that ultimately led to the personal computer and GPS. So how would we adapt that fail early, fail often approach that was so successful in DARPA to health? And how do we use this collective moment to where there's huge economic need around long haulers? So I think there's a political capital right now to do risky research, and there's an institution newly created to do it. So that's what I'm passionate about, and then hope to get that story out in the next month or so. Yeah, we're in the pitch phase.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because for us at Solve, that's how we look at the research that we fund, right? The high risk, high reward. How can we get particularly new researchers into the field with new ideas, and how do we get them to that next step, right? How do we get them to sort of be able to prove their concept so that they can go out and get larger funding? Are you starting to see more people coming into the research field? Do you have any insight into that?
I think so. It's hard to quantify it. And as a writer, from a poetry standpoint, I speak in metaphors more than I can speak in data sometimes, although I try to speak in big data as much as possible. But Dr. Nancy Klimas at Nova Southeastern put it this way in an interview to me that's in the book, that when she first started going to HIV conferences in the 80s, she knew everybody there. And then later on, when the government started funding HIV research, you couldn't go to an HIV conference without bumping into other people. You physically could not move your elbows because it was so packed. And people had coffee stains on their shirts because they were spilling coffee on themselves because they were bumping into everybody. And I thought that was a very vivid metaphor for where we might get in long COVID research because of new government funding coming into this field, that we don't want to be in a situation where we go to an ME or chronic illness conference and know all the researchers there. We do want to get to the point where there's 10,000 people in a ballroom. There's so much excitement in the room that you can't move, and that you're spilling a drink or tea on other people. And because of the sheer economic need here and some of the initial government funding coming in, I think that's where we want to shoot for. And I think we're moving in that direction. That was what Dr. Klimas was feeling when I spoke to her.
We have time for a couple more questions. I do want to ask you, Ryan, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. If we aren't able to get to all of the questions, can we send them to you by email, and maybe you can answer them, and we can relay them to the attendees, relay your answers to the attendees? Yeah. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah, I love that.
So between Ryan and Saul, if we don't get to your question, we will absolutely try to answer it via email. Another question came in sort of along the lines of the NIH Institute. Has there been discussion that you've heard about a new clinical medical specialty? ME CFS patients sort of fall in between the boards a little bit with where they might go to. It might be a rheumatologist, it might be a infectious disease specialist. Have you heard anything about that?
I haven't, but that I think it's an interesting idea, and I think it would be something I would love to check into. That Susanna Fox, who I mentioned earlier, is a leader in thinking about patient-led research. She's been doing some collaborations and some panels with I think Helen Burson, who's from the Council on Medical Specialist Societies, and that's a key thing. If you think about an overarching group that determines certain things about different medical specialists, or specialist societies, how do you delegate to neurology or rheumatology or infectious disease? So I think that would be an intriguing group to check into about whether they felt like there was a critical mass here to create a medical specialty around post-viral illness. And I know for just the clinic I go to treats fibromyalgia, ME CFS, and chronic Lyme, and they now treat COVID long haulers too. So I think that that's an interesting, certainly it might not be as huge a specialty as neurology, but I think there's clearly precedent for creating interventional radiology is a newer subspecialty, and so I think that's possible for sure. It's a good idea.
I'd like to finish with give you one last opportunity. That you wrote in your book, this is a quote from your book: "The goal of medicine is to cure disease, yes, but even more than that, it is to embrace the sick and to give them back the sacred gift of being able to dream." That's super important, right? We know that having hope improves mental conditions, which can improve physical conditions. How important is that? And did you see signs of hope while you were researching the book? And what else can we kind of do to generate that?
Right. I frequently come back to this quote from the poet Charles Bukowski, who says that there is a light somewhere. It may not be much light, but it beats the darkness. And I have another friend, Dr. David Fagenbaum, who's a clinician researcher who had Castleman disease, who's a similar disease causing cytokine storms to what we experience. And his memoir is a doctor's race to turn hope into action. So hope is a vital part of the innovation process. And I think that in my own life, I've just experienced that having a sense of hope, or even a sense of curiosity that the next treatment might be the one. In feeling that we have a responsibility to be part of the scientific endeavor, to participate in clinical trials, to be part of the collective unfolding of humanity's understanding of ourselves, that makes this something exciting. But the pieces, the stories I was trying to tell as a journalist were about how do we deal with the human problem of suffering, and how do we think about how to redeem that suffering. And the people who were incredibly sick that I've interviewed in other stories that I thought were inspiring, and who could figure out ways to channel that sense of desperation into rapid new forms of innovation. That necessity is the father of invention. It really is the crux of the matter. And in the Bible, it talks about that faith without works is dead. And I oftentimes could repurpose that to say science without hope is dead.
Ryan, we want to thank you very, very much for taking the time out. We want to remind everybody that Ryan's book, The Long Haul, will be published tomorrow and will be available at booksellers everywhere. Also, we will be doing a giveaway for registrants of this webinar to give away 10 free copies of the book. Would also like to remind people again that at Solve, our work is to help fund innovative research and advocate for better care and better identification of the disease, and for more government funding for research. And so if you'd like to support Solve, you can do so. Again, you have your phone, you can scan the QR code on screen, or you can go to solveme.org/donate to give, and we will put your money to good work to fight the disease. Ryan, again, thank you very much. We'd like to thank everybody for attending. And again, if we were not able to get to your questions, we will try to forward them to Ryan, or if we can provide answers for some of the practical questions, we will be happy to do so. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.